Hello and welcome to another edition of another book review. This week I'll be reviewing Recoding America by Jennifer Pahlka. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I will be reading for next time. Jennifer Pahlka worked under the Obama administration as the deputy chief, I think she was the deputy chief technology officer. She also has founded a nonprofit called Code for America, and has received a lot of accolades from Wired magazine as well as others. This book is her look at the need to reform the way the government, specifically the federal government, but really all levels of government, view and use technology in order to better the lives of citizens of the United States. And to that end, she gives several different examples. She interviews several different people. She talks about her time in the Obama administration. She looks at things like the launch of the ACA website, the look at the COVID test website and kind of comparing those two things. She looks at the prevalence of waterfall development in the federal government specifically, how that relates to vendors, and really just overall the myriad of problems that come along with trying to get tech to work better for average people and where all the different problems can be. So it's the book covers a lot of ground, and I will say I think she does do a pretty good job of giving pretty pertinent examples. She talks about her time working in the state of California and finding ways to streamline the unemployment applications, unemployment benefits system post-COVID, and ways that that program was dealing with a lot of these legacy issues, and it did a good job, I think, of showing some of the counterintuitive nature of the way that the break between implementation and policy making. And that's a big theme of the book that she comes back to again and again and again, is you have almost a repeated story where the legislators will legislate something, the bureaucratic forces under them take it upon themselves to implement these policies. Typically they'll work with outside vendors, and then something will go wrong. And then they get called to task when that goes wrong. The public finds out, or the public pressures the legislators to take these bureaucrats to account. They get in front of the legislators and they ask them, well, what happened here? What went wrong? And they're like, well, we're actually just following the policies that you've set forth, the legislators. And so ultimately, you are the one to blame. And that's kind of the big thing in the book, is there's a break between that and the break between legislation and implementation. And I think she does a good job of using that California unemployment system example as the real bottleneck in that process was there were just not enough people who were trained in the systems to really get the results that they were looking for. The government came in and hired a bunch of temp people who were untrained, and so they actually made that system setup worse, and we're actually having fewer successful outputs after that than before. And so it's the old tech joke of the 9 women, 1 month, no babies type of thing. And so that you see that kind of throughout the book, and her talking about that issue, dealing with these old legacy systems that fewer and fewer people know how to actually operate, that haven't been updated. In part, you have all these cost overruns that have occurred in dealing with the procurement process and the issues with the procurement process. The kind of the public versus private view of technologists. She goes back to the 1960s when she talks about how when what we kind of deemed computer technology first became to be used by the government, it was quickly determined that there were certain things that were not in the purview of the government. One of them being technology was really more deemed to be something that should be outsourced to others. And that, in her opinion, kind of leads to this dearth of technological knowledge in much of the government today. She kind of looks at all levels of government, but she kind of talks about how pointed it is in the federal level, and how there's oftentimes a mistrust between the individuals who are at the top of these organizations and how they view technologists and how they view their job more as checking boxes, because that's a safer route, than to focusing on what she views as program management, or some would say user design, the end user's experience with whatever it is that they're trying to do. And she looks at the VA, and the VA legacy system is another real pointed example of how there are incentives at work for that system to be as poorly managed and designed as it is. And then she kind of goes into some of those things. She goes into why pre-filled forms are so rare, and she talks about the need to exchange information between different government agencies and how that can be difficult. There were some things that I had questions about in that part, but I did understand what she was saying. I think the book is very well written and very clear to understand. I'm someone who, I'm not in the tech space, but there's some work that I do that's kind of tech adjacent, and so a lot of this wasn't brand new to me. I've also had to fill out applications on the USA Jobs website at times in my life, and that's never been a pleasant experience. So those were some things that I was kind of aware about. Overall, I enjoyed the book. I think it's a quick read. If there were some things that I was maybe less enthralled with, she starts with an example of expunging records for people who had marijuana convictions, felony marijuana convictions in California. I think this is Proposition 64, if I'm mistaken. She has a chapter later in the book comparing that proposition to another proposition, which was to expunge records for felonies that resulted in damaged or stolen property of less than $950, and how those two things ultimately were handled very, very differently. My only issue with her putting the marijuana thing at the beginning, there's a couple times in the there's a couple points in the book where she conflates things, and this is one of those points where she conflates usage of marijuana with a marijuana felony, because those are two very, very different things. Someone can use marijuana, and a lot of people recreationally use marijuana, but for you to catch a felony for marijuana, presuming that you have no other criminal activity that you're engaged in, I looked it up. Before this proposition, you need like a gram of marijuana, which is a fairly large amount of marijuana. Another way to frame this is that if you're getting caught and charged with a felony for marijuana, you are almost assuredly a dealer. You're not a user, and she conflates usage with dealing, which is not the same thing. 99 times out of 100, most people wouldn't be bothered by this, but to me it kind of got my hackles up because she conflated these two things, and so I found myself more defensive than I would be for the rest of the book. And I think she could have just cut that and would have been okay, because she kind of talks about this later in the book. And Jennifer has maybe some political opinions, having worked in the Obama White House, that I maybe don't share. And one of them is kind of around expunging records and the need for that. It's not a huge part of the book, but it was one of those things where there was that example. There's another part in the book. I can't remember exactly what she conflates, but she conflates, that's probably what it was. It was I think it was interactions with the government for wealthier individuals and poorer individuals, and she conflates two things there as well. They're relatively minor things, but they did bother me. There's some repetition in the book. She has a fairly long conclusion chapter where she kind of brings all these things together. She kind of throws out towards the end the frustration she has with the Silicon Valley, really the titans of Silicon Valley, so the Mark Zuckerbergs and Elon Musks of the world. I think that probably could have been cut, or it should have either been cut or expanded upon. There is a part in the book that I like that she does where she talks about the public versus private view of technology in terms of the public sector versus the private sector. I thought that was actually really well done, where she talks about why some people would want to go into public service with some of these skills. I thought that was nicely done. There's a part in the conclusion, though, where she kind of, I think she elides a little bit over how difficult it is to join the federal government and how that system in and of itself may be creating some of these problems, because it is a fairly long and lengthy hiring process just to get a federal job. And she doesn't really mention that. And so there's an acknowledgement that these skills are needed within the government, and she points to the need to train individuals who are already in the government for these skills. And I certainly think that that's part of what can be done, but I think that there's also seems to be a dearth of being able to bring new people into federal service relatively quickly that I think is part of this issue as well. So overall, what I thought this was a really good primer on where digital services can oftentimes go wrong, and the myriad of ways that they can go wrong. And she kind of points to, at the end of the book, the importance of getting this right as we have these really grave challenges to America in the coming 20, 30 years. and how she thinks that faith in government is tied directly to the ability for people to use some of these services. Does she overplay that point to some degree? I think she may overplay that point to some degree. I think one of the things that she mentions is that and this is in the conclusion, is the inability for people to use government services when they really need them will oftentimes lead to a general apathy of the government. One would think that the corollary of that would be true, which is when someone is able to use a service or a policy to benefit their lives, that they would reward those politicians with their support. And that's not really ever shown in the data, and she doesn't really mention that corollary, which one would also see. I could point to current political events and individuals who are running for office right now and say, I don't really see that in the way I view the world. But so I did wish that corollary was also there, talked about, if she was going to bring up what I thought was kind of the negative side of that, to also bring up the positive side and to point out where, it's not also clear to me at what point in time people are aware of these things or not aware of these things if they don't use these services. She points to, COVID test. I think it was covidtest.com, where people could get 4 free COVID tests, which was the first time I knew about this website was reading this book. I don't think I would have used the service if I had known about it, because I wasn't really in a position where I don't think I needed it at the time. I was pretty well quarantined. But she points to that as a very, very success. The degree to which that is a success due to the simplicity and the ability for that website to have connection with the postal service, which was to me like 95% of the battle. I understand what she was saying, but I also felt that if anything, was kind of a layup. And I don't know how much credit we should be giving the federal government that has access to trillions of dollars for performing layups. That, for me. And so this book was interesting. I think it's interesting in conversation with other books I've read in the past. The Fifth Risk by Michael Lewis being the one that's closest to my mind. But overall, if you've ever thought about, the United States government, what they do with technology, why they seem to be behind the times when it comes to technology, I think this book does a very, very good job of diving into it and explaining really at all levels, as far as the political will to do these things, the skill, ability for them to do these things, the culture sometimes of fear that prevents people from doing things, the very clear ability for user experience feedback to get to the government, which is oftentimes very difficult to do. I think that all came together, was really interesting. She didn't really go as deeply as I would have liked to her have gone into the ACA website in kind of the explanation of why healthcare.gov, I think, was the website that crashed. I wish she'd maybe gone a little deeper into that. I mean, that's talked about, but not to the detail I would have liked. And she seems to have some excuses for it failing that I thought were a little quick. But Recoding America, if someone who's thought about this or wanted to learn more about it, I think it does a very good job. It's very clearly written, and it's a very quick read, repetitive in some places, but I think overall was really well done. So that's Jennifer Pahlka, Recoding America. Next time I'm going to be reading The Salt Grows Heavy by Cassandra. I believe the last name is Kaw. Until next time, please, if you haven't liked the video, subscribe to the channel, and until next time, bye.